Edward Harrison stood in front of the grand mirror in his expansive office, adjusting his cufflinks, his reflection a portrait of success. His tailored suit, a deep navy blue, hugged his frame perfectly, the dark fabric catching the light in all the right places. With a confident smile, he ran his fingers through his perfectly combed hair and adjusted his tie, his image one of quiet authority. The room around him was equally pristine. The polished mahogany furniture gleamed under the warm glow of the chandelier, and the view of the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows spoke of power, wealth, and influence. It was a world he had built with his own hands, brick by brick, and it was a world he ruled. For those who saw him, Edward was the epitome of the American dream. A self-made man who had inherited not just the family business but a legacy of philanthropy and civic duty. His name was synonymous with generosity and high society in Briardale Heights, a wealthy suburban enclave in North Carolina. At charity galas, Edward was the one to lead the bidding at auctions, the one whose every word carried weight. And yet, beneath the surface of this flawless exterior, there was a secret, one so dark, so unthinkable, it could unravel the very foundation of his carefully constructed life. Edward had everything: the wealth, the admiration, the power, and the perfect family. Or at least, that's how it seemed to everyone else. Inside the house that overlooked Briardale Heights, his wife Claire moved through the halls, her elegant steps light but heavy with a burden of her own. Claire Harrison, a woman of grace and beauty, had once been the shining star of their life together. She had thrown herself into the role of the perfect society wife, hosting parties, attending charity events, and being the picture of elegance. But the cracks in their marriage were starting to show. She had noticed Edward's increasing distractions over the past year, his late nights at the office, his sudden absences. For the first time in years, Claire felt something she hadn't before, the icy sting of isolation. The intimate connection they once shared had frayed, and in its place was a growing distance, one that she couldn't ignore. At night, she would lie awake beside him, feeling the coldness of his back turned away from hers. Something was off, but she couldn't put her finger on it. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Ethan's footsteps coming down the stairs. Her son, Reed, had grown up before her eyes, his transformation from a sullen teenager to a promising young adult a source of pride for her. Ethan Harrison, not by blood, but by marriage, had always been a little different. Initially distant and rebellious, Ethan had finally settled into a rhythm of his own, studying at the local community college, working on projects to improve the environment of Briardale Heights. But his relationship with Edward was something Claire could never quite understand. Ethan and Edward had grown close in the past few years, far too close for Claire's comfort. She noticed the way they spent hours in the study together, the quiet conversations, the secret smiles. There was an intimacy between them that she couldn't ignore, but she didn't dare confront it. Not yet. She wasn't ready to face the truth, that the very family she had worked so hard to protect might be built on lies. As Claire watched Ethan walk into the living room, her heart sank. He looked so much like his father now, confident, handsome, with that same glint in his eye. But Claire couldn't shake the feeling that the man standing before her was a stranger, a young man whose growing bond with Edward was both a blessing and a curse. Something was wrong, and Claire could feel it deep in her bones. That night, as the family sat down to dinner, the tension in the air was palpable. Conversations were strained, glances exchanged but never held. Edward, ever the master of diplomacy, smiled and made small talk, but his mind was elsewhere. Ethan pushed his food around on his plate, barely tasting it, while Claire sat quietly, a storm brewing inside her. She had to know the truth. But at what cost? Little did Claire know, the truth was already in motion, hurtling toward them with the inevitability of a storm, and when it hit, it would destroy everything in its path. The perfect family. The perfect life. It was all about to unravel. Ethan Harrison stood in the doorway of the study, his hands stuffed in his pockets, watching his stepfather, Edward, as he stared out the window. The evening sky was bathed in soft hues of orange and pink, but Edward's gaze seemed fixed on something beyond the horizon, something far away. Ethan shifted his weight nervously, unsure whether to speak or to leave the room. There was a strange tension hanging in the air, one that had been building for months. Edward finally turned, his face softening into the familiar, fatherly smile. "Ethan, come in. You're just in time for our usual routine." Ethan smiled weakly, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. He stepped further into the room, glancing at the desk piled high with paperwork. He used to admire Edward's discipline, the way he always stayed on top of things, the way he commanded respect in the boardroom and in their home. But lately, he found it harder to admire the man who had raised him, harder to ignore the discomfort that bubbled up inside him every time they were alone together. "What's on your mind?" Edward's voice was warm, inviting, but there was something about it that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. They had always shared moments like this, quiet conversations, long talks about their future, about the town, about the family business. But now, the words felt hollow, as if they were both playing a part in a script they had long since forgotten. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, looking at the books on the shelf, the ones they had both read together. Some were about business, others about philosophy, some even about the environment, topics that had once brought them closer. But today, it was different. There was a barrier between them, invisible but suffocating. "I'm just thinking about college," Ethan said, trying to sound casual, though the knot in his stomach grew tighter with each passing moment. "I'm almost done with my second year. I don't know what's next. I don't know what I want to do after this." Edward smiled again, but this time, there was something almost condescending in his expression. "You've got plenty of time, Ethan. You'll figure it out. You're a bright kid. I'm proud of you." Ethan clenched his jaw, feeling the weight of those words. He wanted to believe them, wanted to feel the validation that Edward had always promised him. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the praise was always more about Edward's need to mold him into the perfect image of a son, a replacement for the child he'd never had. "You're not thinking about joining the company?" Edward asked, his voice casual but tinged with expectation. Ethan shook his head. "I don't know, Edward. I think I want to make my own path. I'm doing the environmental science project right now. It's something I care about." Edward's expression tightened for just a moment, a flicker of something Ethan couldn't quite read crossing his face. But then, he masked it with a nod. "I see. You're a good boy, Ethan. I just want you to be happy. You know that." Ethan wanted to believe him, but it felt like a lie. There was too much between them now. Too much unsaid. He could feel Edward's eyes on him, always watching, always waiting for something, approval, obedience, affection. Ethan couldn't give it anymore, not like he used to. The silence between them stretched out. Ethan found himself remembering a time when they were closer, before the secret between them had grown so large it overshadowed everything else. Before he realized how much of his affection for Edward had been cultivated, not born from natural love but from a man's desire to control, to shape, to possess. Edward had always been there, teaching him how to fish, how to behave at social events, how to hold himself with confidence. But it wasn't just fatherly advice. It was control, a careful molding of who Ethan was supposed to be, who Edward needed him to be. Ethan's thoughts flickered back to the quiet moments in the house, when their interactions became too charged, too uncomfortable. The moments when their closeness shifted into something else entirely. Something that Ethan had tried to ignore, something that couldn't be dismissed as fatherly affection any longer. He had tried to push it down, tell himself it was just his imagination, just a misunderstanding, but deep down, he knew the truth. He and Edward had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. That night at the farmer's market, when they had both been caught up in a private conversation, laughing and talking about organic farming, Ethan had felt it. The way Edward's eyes lingered too long, the way his touch seemed just a little too familiar, a little too intimate. And when their old family friend, Zoe, had come to find him, the way they both had hastily pulled away, as if they had been caught in a forbidden act, still haunted Ethan's thoughts. But the worst part was how Edward pretended nothing was wrong. He brushed it off, as if nothing had changed. It was just a fleeting moment, a misunderstanding, or so Edward claimed. But Ethan knew better. And now, he couldn't unsee it. "What are we doing, Edward?" Ethan asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes avoiding his stepfather's gaze. Edward paused, his face unreadable, but for a moment, Ethan could have sworn he saw something flash in his eyes, fear, maybe, or guilt. But it was gone before he could be sure. "Nothing, Ethan," Edward said, his voice steady, calm. Too calm. "We're just talking. Nothing's changed." But Ethan knew better. Everything had changed. And it was only a matter of time before the truth would finally be exposed, and the walls that had been carefully built around their lives would come crashing down. Claire Harrison had always been the embodiment of elegance. Tall, poised, with eyes that carried the kind of warmth that could light up any room, she had been the perfect match for Edward. Together, they made a picture of the perfect couple, the kind of couple everyone envied. Their life, built on shared values of community involvement, philanthropy, and societal expectations, was one of admiration and respect. She had willingly embraced her role as the dutiful wife, throwing herself into the social duties of the family, chairing committees, hosting dinner parties, and participating in every event that required a respectable presence. But somewhere along the way, Claire had lost herself. At first, it had been subtle, small, fleeting moments of unease. A glance from Edward that felt colder than it used to be. The quiet, lingering silences during their dinners, once filled with laughter and shared stories. She had brushed it off, convincing herself that the demands of their life, the pressures of maintaining the perfect facade, were simply wearing them both down. But as the months wore on, the distance between them grew undeniable. Edward had always been distant at times, absorbed in his work, but there was something different about his absence now. He wasn't just physically distant, he had become emotionally unreachable. Claire had spent countless sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quite put together. Something had changed between them, and it wasn't just the stress of his business or the burdens of their social calendar. It was something deeper, something far more insidious. She had noticed the subtle signs, the late nights at the office, the unexplained meetings, the way he seemed to retreat into himself. The affection between them, once so natural and easy, had dulled to a mere formality. But it wasn't just Edward that Claire noticed. There was a shift in Ethan, too. At first, Claire had dismissed it as a normal phase. Ethan, her son from her first marriage, had always been distant in his teenage years, struggling to adjust to life in a small town after the move from Boston. But something had changed in him, too. He had grown quieter, more withdrawn. His grades had improved, his commitment to his environmental projects had increased, and he was becoming a responsible young man. Claire couldn't help but feel proud of him. He had come so far, transformed from the rebellious teen into someone with a promising future. And yet, as the months went by, Claire began to notice a growing distance between herself and Ethan. It wasn't that he didn't talk to her anymore, but there were moments when it felt like they were living in parallel worlds. The bond they had once shared had frayed. She watched as he and Edward grew closer, spending more and more time together. At first, she thought it was a healthy father-son relationship. They both enjoyed gardening, fishing, and discussing the family business. But as the weeks passed, Claire felt something change in the way they interacted, something she couldn't quite pinpoint but couldn't ignore. It wasn't just the conversations they had, it was the way they looked at each other, the subtle exchanges between them that felt too intimate. Claire tried to brush it off. She told herself it was just her overactive imagination, the result of too much stress and worry about their family's social standing. But in the pit of her stomach, she felt the uncomfortable suspicion growing. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a quiet, nagging voice that kept telling her there was something more to their relationship than she was willing to admit. The tipping point came one evening, when Claire overheard a conversation between Edward and Ethan. She had been returning from a dinner party, her evening gown still on, and had taken a detour through the back hall to avoid running into anyone else. She heard the sound of laughter from the study, Edward's deep voice and Ethan's light, almost flirtatious laugh. The tone of their conversation was different from what Claire had ever heard before. It wasn't casual, it was too intimate, too familiar. She had paused, hidden in the shadows of the hallway, her breath catching in her throat as she listened. They were talking about a trip, about a weekend getaway, and the way Edward spoke to Ethan made Claire's heart race. The words seemed innocent enough, but there was an undertone in Edward's voice, a tenderness that unsettled Claire. It was the kind of tone he used when speaking to her early in their marriage, before life and responsibilities had worn away the edges of their passion. And the way Ethan responded, the way he laughed, the way he seemed to lean into Edward's words, sent a chill down Claire's spine. Her hands trembled as she leaned against the doorframe, the weight of the truth beginning to settle in her chest like a rock. She didn't need to hear any more. She knew. She had known for months, but hearing it confirmed, hearing them both in their private world, was a reality she could no longer deny. Claire had never been the type of woman to be blindsided. She had always prided herself on being able to read people, to understand them. But this? This was different. It wasn't just about her husband's betrayal, it was about her family, the one she had worked so hard to build. And suddenly, that perfect facade, that life they had carefully constructed, felt like a lie. She left the house that night, her mind in a whirl. She drove through the quiet streets of Briardale Heights, the headlights cutting through the dark, trying to find a moment of clarity in the chaos of her thoughts. But the truth was undeniable. Edward and Ethan were more than just father and son. The betrayal ran deeper than she had ever imagined, and now she had to face the ugly reality of what had been happening right under her nose. When she returned home, Edward was waiting for her, as if nothing had changed. He smiled and asked about the event, his voice full of casual interest. But Claire knew, deep down, that their world had shifted, irreparably so. And no matter how hard she tried to pretend otherwise, the damage had already been done. The weight of betrayal was too heavy to ignore. And Claire Harrison, the perfect wife, the perfect mother, stood at the edge of the life she had built, knowing that everything she had known, everything she had worked for, was about to unravel. Detective Sarah Bennett stood at the threshold of the Harrison family estate, her sharp eyes scanning the property. Briardale Heights was known for its sprawling homes and manicured lawns, a place where appearances mattered and secrets had a way of festering beneath the polished surfaces. The Harrison house, an imposing mansion set atop a hill, was no exception. It gleamed in the late afternoon sun, its stately exterior hiding the turmoil inside. Bennett had been on the force for over 15 years, but something about this case felt different. She had handled her share of domestic disputes, but the undercurrents here were deeper, far more dangerous. The murders of Edward and Ethan Harrison were not just a brutal act of violence. There was a story behind them, a story that would take careful unraveling. And as she stood there, listening to the hum of the investigators setting up around her, she knew the answers weren't going to come easy. The scene inside was every bit as chilling as she had anticipated. The study, where the bodies had been discovered, was a room of contradictions. On the one hand, it was impeccably organized, with dark wood paneling, expensive leather-bound books, and a desk that seemed untouched by the chaos that had unfolded there. But then there were the small, disturbing details, the crystal tumbler shattered on the floor beside Edward's body, the bloodstains on the thick Persian rug. The quiet, methodical nature of the crime suggested that whoever had committed it knew exactly what they were doing. As Bennett stepped into the room, the cold, metallic scent of blood hung in the air, mingling with the faint, acrid scent of fear. She made a mental note of the unusual absence of forced entry. The windows were intact, the doors locked from the inside. Whoever had committed this crime had been invited in, or had been part of the household. That alone made it personal. Bennett didn't believe in coincidences, and she certainly didn't believe in the randomness of domestic murders. There was always a pattern, always a motive, and she intended to find it. "Detective," one of the forensics officers called as she approached the desk. "We've finished processing the bodies." Bennett nodded but didn't speak. Her gaze lingered on Edward's body first, sprawled across the desk. He had been taken by surprise, likely caught off guard by whoever had entered the room. There were no signs of a struggle from him, no defensive wounds, which suggested that he had known his killer. Ethan's body, however, was different. He had been found near the fireplace, his arm outstretched as though reaching for something, or someone. The contrast between the two positions was enough to make Bennett pause. One of them had been the victim of a brutal, unprovoked attack. The other had tried to escape. "Detective, you might want to see this," a voice called from the corner. Bennett turned to find one of the officers holding up a small object in their gloved hand. It was a letter opener, its silver blade gleaming in the harsh light of the room. It had been wiped clean, but there were traces of blood on the handle. Bennett's pulse quickened. This was no random attack. It was controlled, deliberate. Whoever had done this had taken their time, ensured that no evidence was left behind. But there was something else. A piece of paper on the desk, partially hidden beneath Edward's outstretched hand, caught Bennett's attention. She bent down and carefully moved it aside, revealing a torn corner of a document, a scrap of something larger. It was enough to send a chill down her spine. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the words were unmistakable. The note read simply, "It's over." Bennett stood up, deep in thought. A quick glance at the rest of the room revealed several more items of interest: 2 empty wine glasses on the coffee table, an untouched breakfast plate still sitting on the kitchen counter, the faint smell of something off in the air. The evidence was piling up, and with it came more questions than answers. She stepped outside to where her team had set up, giving instructions to secure the perimeter. The first phase of the investigation was complete. Now, it was time to dig deeper into the lives of the victims, and the family they left behind. Over the next several days, Detective Bennett and her team pored over the lives of Edward and Ethan Harrison, looking for any clue, any piece of information that could shed light on the truth. They interviewed the household staff, asking them about the dynamics of the family, about any odd behavior they had witnessed. The housekeeper, Mrs. Collins, was the first to speak up. "There were whispers," she said nervously, wringing her hands. "Edward and Ethan, they were close. Closer than most father and son pairs. I didn't think much of it at first. It's just the way things are in the Harrison family, you know? They work together, they spend time together. But then it started to feel different, like there was something more." Bennett's instincts kicked in. She pressed Mrs. Collins for more details, but the woman was hesitant, reluctant to speak further. It was clear that whatever was happening in the Harrison household had remained hidden from public view, and even from those closest to the family. But Bennett could feel it, the undercurrent of tension, the sense that the Harrison family's perfect image was a carefully constructed facade. Another break came when they turned their attention to the digital lives of the victims. The Harrison family had embraced technology, with smart home systems controlling everything from security to temperature. It was supposed to be a luxury, but now, it was an invaluable resource. Bennett's team worked quickly to retrieve the data from the security cameras, pulling footage from the night of the murders. The footage was damning. At 7:30 p.m., Claire had left the house for a charity gala in Raleigh, as confirmed by multiple sources. But the cameras had caught her at 11:45 p.m., well after the gala had ended, her car pulling into the driveway. The timing didn't add up, and the cameras had failed to record her return to the house after the event. The evidence, when combined with cell tower data placing Claire near the Harrison residence at the time of the murders, led to the chilling conclusion: she was there when it happened. Bennett knew that they had found their first key to the puzzle, but she also knew that the answers would not come easily. What had Claire found when she arrived home that night? What had driven her to commit such a brutal act? The investigation was just beginning, and already, Bennett could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on her. The Harrison family's perfect image was shattering before her eyes, and she was determined to uncover every last secret they had worked so hard to keep hidden. The winds had shifted in Briardale Heights. The perfect facade of the Harrison family, so carefully crafted and polished for years, was now beginning to crack. The tragic deaths of Edward and Ethan had not only shattered the peace of this quiet community but had also brought to light the dark, twisted undercurrents of a family at war with itself. For Claire, the truth had come like a tidal wave, sweeping over her, consuming everything in its path. The quiet hum of her life, the life she had spent so many years building, had been obliterated the moment she overheard that conversation. It was a conversation that had exposed her worst fears, that had uncovered the betrayal she had never been ready to face. Edward and Ethan. Father and son, bound not only by blood but by a bond that, in the darkness of the Harrison home, had twisted into something more. Something forbidden. Claire had spent years ignoring the little signs, the strange moments of intimacy between them that made her feel uneasy, but she had always convinced herself it was just her imagination running wild. But that night, the moment of realization had hit her with brutal clarity. She had heard the laughter, the warmth in their voices, but it wasn't the laugh of a father and son who shared an innocent moment. It was something deeper, something darker. The question burned in Claire's mind: how could this happen under her very roof? The realization that Edward, her husband, the man who had sworn to love and protect her, had betrayed her with her own son, the son she had raised, the one she had protected with everything she had, left her cold. She had spent so many years building her life around him, around the family they had created together. But now, the truth was inescapable. The man she had trusted, the man she had given her heart to, had been lying to her. And worse, he had been lying to her son. Ethan, the child she had loved unconditionally, was no longer the innocent young man she thought he was. Edward's betrayal ran deeper than just his affair with Ethan. It was a betrayal of their entire life, of everything Claire had believed in. The love they had once shared had been tainted, transformed into a cruel illusion. There were moments, when the house was quiet, when Claire would close her eyes and think back to the early days of their marriage. She remembered the way Edward had held her, the way he had made her feel like the only woman in the world. But now, all of that was gone. In its place was a dark void, an emptiness that threatened to swallow her whole. And Ethan had always been her pride. She had raised him to be strong, to be good, to be honorable. He had struggled when they first moved to Briardale Heights, but over the years, he had blossomed into a responsible young man. She had always been proud of the way he had turned his life around. But now, every time she looked at him, she saw the man who had crossed a line with Edward, the man who had betrayed her trust. Ethan had known the truth before she had. He had known about the affair, had felt the pull between him and Edward long before Claire had ever suspected. She had asked him once, after she had discovered the truth, how long it had been going on. Ethan had hesitated, his eyes avoiding hers. The silence between them had spoken louder than words ever could. The betrayal that had started as something subtle, something whispered behind closed doors, had now exploded into something that could never be undone. Claire's thoughts turned to that night, to the night of the gala. She had been there, smiling through the pain, pretending to be the woman she was expected to be. But as she stood there, surrounded by the wealthy and powerful, a knot tightened in her stomach. She had known something was wrong. It wasn't just the tension between Edward and Ethan. It was the weight of the lie that had been hanging over her, choking her, making it impossible to breathe. She had never felt more alone, more disconnected from the life she had built. She could no longer pretend that everything was fine, that she was still in control of the world around her. It wasn't until later that night, when she returned home, that the truth fully hit her. Claire had driven back to Briardale Heights, her heart racing, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and anger. She had gotten out of the car, her hands trembling, and had walked into the house. But she hadn't found the solace she expected. The house was quiet, too quiet. No laughter. No warmth. Just silence, heavy and suffocating. It was then that she heard them, Edward and Ethan, still talking, their voices rising and falling in an intimate exchange that Claire could not ignore. She had crept through the house, silent and unseen, her every step slow and deliberate. It was as if time itself had stopped, and she was caught in a moment of unbearable clarity. The truth hit her like a slap in the face. She had reached the door to the study, the door she had never before thought to question. And through the crack, she had seen it, Edward's arm around Ethan, pulling him close. Ethan had laughed softly, but it was different from the way he had ever laughed with her. It was a laugh that was shared, a laugh that spoke of secrets and promises made in the shadows. It was a laugh that shattered her world. Claire's heart had broken then. Not just because of what she saw, but because she had been blind to it for so long. The man she had married, the man who had promised her everything, had taken the one thing that had always been hers, her family. And Ethan, her own son, had betrayed her in the worst way possible. There was no going back now. The love Claire had once felt for Edward was gone, consumed by the flames of betrayal. But more than that, she realized, there was no place for her in the family they had built. She had been a spectator in her own life, watching as Edward and Ethan built something in secret, something that did not include her. As she stood there in the darkness of the study, Claire knew one thing for certain: this was no longer about love. This was about survival. And in that moment, she made a decision. There would be no forgiveness. There would be no more pretending. This house, this life, had been built on lies, and it was time for the truth to come out, no matter the cost. The air in Briardale Heights felt heavy with tension, as if the very ground beneath the Harrison estate was holding its breath. Detective Sarah Bennett had spent days piecing together the puzzle of Edward and Ethan's deaths, her mind racing as she sifted through the evidence, the security footage, the cryptic messages, the strained testimonies. But each revelation only deepened the mystery. The twisted dynamics of the Harrison family were darker than she had ever anticipated, and the truth was more painful than anyone could have imagined. In the quiet of her office, Bennett sat hunched over the stack of evidence. The case seemed simple at first, 2 murders in a family where everything appeared to be perfect. But the more she uncovered, the more it became clear, this wasn't just a crime of passion or a moment of blind rage. There was something methodical at play, something far more calculated and sinister. And at the center of it all was Claire Harrison, the woman who had been the perfect wife and mother, until her world came crashing down. As Bennett examined the final pieces of the puzzle, the realization hit her with a jolt. The motive wasn't just about revenge for a betrayal. It was about control. Claire had lost everything in one shocking moment: her husband's love, her son's loyalty, and the life she had carefully constructed. The walls she had built around herself, around her family, had crumbled. In that instant, she had seen no other option but to take matters into her own hands. The night Claire had arrived home from the charity gala was the turning point. The house, which had once felt like a sanctuary, had become a prison. Her suspicions about Edward and Ethan's relationship had been confirmed, but it wasn't just the affair that had broken her, it was the knowledge that her son, the boy she had nurtured and raised, had become complicit in the destruction of everything she held dear. In her eyes, Edward and Ethan had not just betrayed her trust, they had shattered the very foundation of her identity. The cold, calculating nature of the murder now became clear. Claire had spent the night confronting the truth, and by the time the morning came, she had made her decision. Edward and Ethan had crossed a line, and Claire, who had always been the dutiful wife and mother, would no longer play the role of the victim. When Claire arrived at the house after the gala, she didn't just walk in as a grieving wife. She walked in as a woman who had seen her life unravel in front of her, and who was now prepared to destroy everything in the process of regaining control. The key moment, the moment that had sealed the fate of Edward and Ethan, had been when Claire overheard them speaking in the study. It wasn't just the intimate conversation that had shattered her, it was the realization that she no longer had a place in their world. She was the outsider, the intruder, the one left in the cold. Her fury had been immediate and overwhelming. Claire had never been a violent person, but in that moment, the years of betrayal, the years of doubt, and the unbearable weight of her own helplessness came crashing down. The letter opener on Edward's desk had become a symbol of the power she no longer had, but desperately craved. In one violent sweep, she had taken it, and in her rage, she had struck. But it wasn't just Edward who had paid the price for their shared betrayal. Ethan had also become a casualty of Claire's wrath. In the confusion, in the madness of her fury, Claire had turned on her son, the boy who had once been the center of her world. Perhaps she had blamed him for his role in the destruction of her marriage. Perhaps, in her mind, he had become as guilty as Edward. The way Ethan had reacted, attempting to flee, reaching out toward the fireplace as though to escape, showed just how desperate he was to avoid the consequences of his actions. But there was no escaping the truth. What made the situation even more chilling was Claire's calculated attempt to cover up her actions. As the bloodstains soaked into the Persian rug, Claire had methodically cleaned the scene. She wiped the letter opener, making sure to leave no trace of her involvement. It wasn't just an act of revenge, it was an act of survival. She had to maintain the illusion of the perfect family, of the perfect wife, because without that, she had nothing left. She would play the part of the grieving widow, the broken mother, while secretly knowing that the true culprit was standing right in front of the police. But Claire's carefully constructed alibi would soon begin to unravel. The security footage from the night of the murders told a different story. While she had claimed to be at the gala the entire time, the cameras had captured her car pulling into the driveway at 11:45 p.m., long after the event had ended. The footage showed her movements, quick, hurried, tense. It was the same footage that had shown her leaving the house earlier, a picture-perfect wife playing her part in the public eye. But when the cameras captured her return, it was clear, she wasn't just returning from a night of charity work. She was returning to a scene of violence, a scene she had orchestrated. Claire had returned home that night not just to find her family broken, but to destroy it completely. The act was calculated, deliberate, and ultimately devastating. In her mind, there was no other choice. The power dynamics within the Harrison household had shifted. What had been once Edward's kingdom, a world of control and influence, had become hers to command. Bennett had pieced together the facts, but she still couldn't shake the image of Claire Harrison, standing there, shattered but determined, caught between love and fury, between a mother's heartbreak and a wife's betrayal. Claire's actions had been driven by a complex web of emotions: love, betrayal, control, and an overwhelming desire to reclaim something that had been lost. But the truth could not be hidden for long. As Bennett stood in front of Claire, the woman who had shattered the Harrison family, she knew this was only the beginning. The consequences of Claire's actions would ripple through Briardale Heights, and the fallout would be felt for years to come. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that enveloped you, making every movement feel amplified. Claire Harrison sat in the defendant's chair, her once proud posture now a shadow of the woman she had been. The transformation from the poised, elegant wife and mother to the broken woman in front of the jury was stark, and it was impossible not to notice. The courtroom, filled with the faces of those who had known her for years, looked at her with a mixture of disbelief, confusion, and a touch of pity. They had all once viewed her as the epitome of grace and perfection. But now, they were forced to reckon with the truth, a truth that no one, not even Claire herself, had ever truly anticipated. As the prosecution delivered their closing argument, the weight of Claire's actions settled like a dark cloud. The trial had been long, the evidence damning. Detective Bennett had painstakingly pieced together the facts, and the timeline had left no room for doubt. Claire had been the one to murder both her husband, Edward, and her son, Ethan. Her alibi had unraveled like a cheap suit, with video footage placing her at the scene of the crime long after she claimed to be at the gala. But beyond the physical evidence was something far more chilling: the motive. It was clear to the jury, and to the world, that Claire had killed not out of blind rage, but as an act of survival. The betrayal of her husband and son had broken her, but the act of murder was her twisted way of regaining control over a life that had spun out of her grasp. The defense had tried to argue that Claire had acted in a moment of temporary insanity, driven to violence by the shock of discovering the affair between Edward and Ethan. They painted a picture of a woman pushed to her breaking point, unable to cope with the psychological weight of the betrayal. But the evidence presented by the prosecution painted a different picture, one of a woman who had meticulously planned the murders, driven not just by hurt and anger, but by a cold, calculated desire to take back the power she had lost. In the final moments of the trial, Claire had taken the stand. Her voice trembled as she spoke, recounting the moment when she discovered the truth. Tears streaked down her face as she described the emotional turmoil, the confusion, the overwhelming sense of betrayal that had consumed her. But as she spoke, something shifted. The tears no longer felt genuine, and her words no longer sounded like the confession of a remorseful wife and mother. Instead, they felt rehearsed, as if she had come to terms with the truth of her actions long before stepping into the courtroom. The jury watched her, unmoved by her tears, as the truth of what she had done became impossible to ignore. As the deliberations began, the tension in the courtroom was unbearable. The jury returned with their verdict after what felt like an eternity. Claire Harrison, the woman who had once seemed so untouchable, was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The sentences were read aloud, and Claire, now a shell of the woman who had walked into that courtroom, remained motionless. The judge's voice was firm as he sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Outside the courtroom, the media swarmed, eager to get their final take on the case. The tragedy of the Harrison family would haunt Briardale Heights for years to come. Claire's story, once a symbol of success, had become a cautionary tale of how love, betrayal, and control could destroy everything. But even as Claire was led away in handcuffs, the question lingered in the air. Was she truly a victim of circumstance? Or had she crossed a line that could never be uncrossed? Was it the weight of betrayal that drove her to murder? Or was it something deeper, something that had always existed beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge? The family that had once appeared perfect was now broken beyond repair. The community of Briardale Heights would never forget the horrors that had unfolded in the quiet mansion at the top of the hill. The Harrison legacy, built on power and influence, had been shattered. But for Detective Bennett, the case was not over. She knew that there were always more layers to uncover, more pieces of the story that hadn't been told. For every answer, there seemed to be more questions. And that, she realized, was what made this case so haunting, the realization that, sometimes, the truth is even darker than the lie. What do you think about Claire's actions? Was she justified in her decision, or was it a case of overwhelming betrayal? How do you feel about the way Edward and Ethan's relationship developed? Do you think Claire could have handled things differently? Do you think Claire's actions were a result of temporary insanity, or was it a calculated move for control? What lessons can we learn from this tragic tale of love, betrayal, and murder? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts with us. Your opinion matters, and we'd love to hear how you interpret the twists and turns of this case.